very exciting and stimulating lecture on the Jews of South Africa. So I turn the meeting without further delay over to Sasha. Sasha, please.
Thank you and welcome everybody to the Michael Goldmeier Memorial Lecture, which I am very honored to chair as head of Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies. Michael was one of the early victims of the COVID pandemic at a time when the disease was still poorly understood. People around us were talking about an unprecedented historical event, but I very quickly rejoined at the time and said, this is not unprecedented, this is tragic, because it really was tragic. However, we are not here to mourn over the passing of Michael, but to celebrate his memory. Michael was an exemplary student in the department. He was known for his motivation, his enthusiasm to learn, and the hard work he put into his studies. It was very clear from what we saw in the department that whatever he undertook in life, whatever he did in life, he did it properly. He did it fully and properly, and he put all the work that needed to go into it. I personally didn't have the merit of teaching him very much. I think I only gave him a few lectures, but it was always a great joy to see him in the corridor of the department. He was also a very humble person, and I think very few of us knew, if anyone in fact knew, the very important communal involvement he had had in the Jewish community, the various projects which he had run, the committees that he had sat on, and the contributions he made to the Jewish community through his professional career. And I've got actually a story to tell you about this, an interesting story, but I actually met him already in the late 1980s, when I was just finishing my MA degree and trying to find ways of sustaining myself through my doctoral studies. So I started applying for jobs. So I applied for a job, Jewish chaplaincy in Manchester. And Michael was there, even though he was from London, but he was evidently involved in the chaplaincy and he was there on the panel. I didn't get the job, which is probably just as well, but Michael, who was there, came up to me afterwards and said that from his perspective, I was the best candidate and a similar job was coming up in London and you must apply for the job in London. So I applied for the job in London and again, Michael was there in the panel. I didn't get the job, again, just as well. But after that, Michael came back to me. This was really such an act of kindness on his part. And he said to me that, you know, really, we need to find you something. And within a few weeks, I actually found a job in adult education at the United Synagogue, which was actually much better, actually. It was the best thing I could have hoped for at the time. And I was incredibly grateful for him. The thing is that when he joined the department, some 30 odd years later, he had gone very white and I didn't recognize him. And I don't know if he recognized me or if he remembered me, I'm not sure. But it was only after he passed away and I read his obituary in the Times with a photo of him from the 1980s that I suddenly recognized, my gosh, this is Michael Goldmeier. Because I saw him exactly as I remembered him at the time. And then I was very upset that I never had the opportunity or never took the opportunity to go up to him when he was in the department and remind him of these years long ago and, you know, and really of thanking him for all the help he had done for me. So anyway, but I hope that this memorial lecture is my own way, perhaps, of saying thank you to Michael, even after his demise. I would like to hand over at this point to our lecturer of tonight. Before doing so, I would like to warn everyone that the lecture is being recorded, which means that if you don't want to be seen, for example, on the screen, you can block off your video. There will not be a formal session of questions and answers at the end. However, members of the audience are invited to put their comments in the chat. And if there is time at the end, some of the questions will be picked up and read out to Professor Gilbert, and she will address them. But I regret to say in advance that it will have to be, to a certain extent, selective. Now, to introduce Professor Shirli Gilbert, who recently joined the department about 2 years ago from Southampton. She is a specialist in modern Jewish history. She is professor of modern Jewish history in the department with a particular interest in the Holocaust and its legacies, modern Jewish identity, and the Jews of South Africa. She is making a tremendous contribution to the department with a cohort of PhD students, and she's also teaching in the Department of History. So we are very privileged to have her with us. She holds a DPhil in modern history from the University of Oxford. She was a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows at the University of Michigan. And to cut a long story short, this is Shirli Gilbert, and she's going to present something about her research on the German Jewish refugees in apartheid South Africa. Shirli, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for the warm introduction, and Mark too for the introduction. And hello to everyone here. It's so wonderful to see such a lovely big crowd with lots of familiar names and faces, and also lots of new names and faces. So welcome. Thank you so much for giving of your evening or afternoon, wherever you are, to join us. I really feel honored to be giving this lecture in memory of Michael Goldmeier. Michael and his wife, Philippa, attended a course that I gave on turning points in modern Jewish history at Mill Hill Synagogue early last year, just before the pandemic. And I remember exactly where Michael was sitting. He was sitting in the front to my right. And I remember the really astute, sometimes quite challenging questions he asked during my lectures. And I also remember talking with him about his MA research on the 43 group, which he was so passionate about. I know that Philippa is going to pay tribute to him after the lecture, so I won't say too much about him now, even though, as Sasha mentioned, there is so much to say about his extraordinary and committed work for the Jewish community in this country, in the UK, alongside his very accomplished professional career. But one thing I will say is that before all of those things, he was a child of German Jewish refugees who came to this country to escape the Nazis. And so my talk tonight is not only given in his memory, but also takes on a subject that was close to his own heart. So thanks so much again to the family for giving me the honor of giving this lecture. I also want to very briefly take the opportunity to give a little plug for the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which I direct alongside my work at UCL, and specifically to say that for those of you who are interested, I'll be teaching a 6-week course on Jews in South Africa on Zoom starting next month. So please do take a look at our website, and Bethany, our Associate Director, has very helpfully put something in the chat with a link. Please do take a look and join us if you are interested. Right, so let me jump into the topic of my talk tonight, which is German Jewish refugees in South Africa. South Africa was not a significant destination for Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Between 1933 and 1939, around 6,000 Jews landed on its shores, barely 2% of the total number who left. For the most part, they came to South Africa not because of a particular desire or any familiarity, but simply because, for a time at least, it was one of the few places in the world that would let them in. In my talk, I want to explore a specific aspect of German Jewish refugees' experiences in South Africa at this time, and that is their understanding of and attitudes towards racism in South Africa. Now, there is a small body of research that exists on this community, But in that literature, the focus has been overwhelmingly on the contributions that these refugees made to South African social and cultural life, the very close-knit communities that they established upon their arrival, and the extraordinary array of institutions that they established for German Jews, for themselves, to support and sustain their community life. But we actually know very little about how these refugees perceived and understood the racist practices that they encountered in their new homeland. We know that a number of them distinguished themselves for their outspoken political opposition to South African racism, but the majority engaged with their adopted country in more ambivalent ways. I should say from the beginning that this is very much work in progress. I'm going to use some examples from my earlier book, From Things Lost, which was based on a huge letter collection of one of these German Jewish refugees to South Africa, a man named Rudolf Schwab. But in addition to that, I'm drawing on a wide range of additional source materials, including interviews with German Jewish refugees, which were collected by the Kaplan Center at the University of Cape Town, also many interviews given to the Shoah Visual History Foundation, various testimonies and memoirs given to the Association for Jewish Refugees in the UK, and various other published memoirs, personal accounts, correspondence. So quite a large body of primary source material. And so, since I'm still working my way through it, the conclusions that I'm going to outline today are preliminary. And so, as always, I very much welcome your comments and questions. So let me give a little bit of context to the arrival of German Jewish refugees in South Africa. Why South Africa? Well, some chose the country because of ties to family and friends that had perhaps come earlier, or it had been recommended to them as a destination. But the most common reason given, as I suggested in my opening, was because we could. It was one of the few places that would allow them in for a time. The newcomers knew almost nothing about the country, and for the most part, they came with nothing. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. So this is a quote from one former refugee who recalled, "Like so many of my compatriots, I arrived in Cape Town in 1936 without any funds, and what was even more serious, without the necessary deposit. I shall never forget my feeling of dismay whilst I sat on the deck of our ship, not knowing what was going to happen to me and not having the remotest idea of what the future held. I've never felt more miserable in my life. No one who's experienced this feeling of despair and frustration can realize the feelings which overcame these refugees from Germany at that time." Another refugee recalled that before arriving in South Africa, he believed that lions walked around in the streets, while another wrote, "We thought we would come directly into the jungle. We did not have the faintest idea about this country. I thought we would come into a country that was completely black." And one hears many similar comments, particularly about the animals walking around in the street, that they really had almost no sense of this place that they were coming to. Of the total number of German Jews who came to South Africa in this period, which, as I mentioned, was around 6,000, about 64% were male, and most arrived alone. The refugees were also relatively young, so 65% of them were under the age of 40. They had obviously taken the advice of organizations in Germany and retrained in occupations that would hopefully provide them with greater employment opportunities when they arrived. So while 32% of them still claimed that their occupation was business or commerce, fully 45% of them declared that their means of livelihood was trade, industry, or agriculture. So the portrait of the average refugee arriving in South Africa in this period shows us an unmarried man who is young or middle-aged, who made the journey to South Africa alone, worked in a trade, and probably had very little money. Now, of course, creating a new life in a new country is always full of uncertainties. And the problems of these refugees in South Africa were on some level the same problems that confront refugees wherever they end up, and particularly Jewish refugees in this particular historical period. The challenge of leaving roots and homelands, learning a new language, finding work, finding a place to live, adjusting to new social, economic, cultural, political conditions. We know that most refugees took on menial work, which was not only a blow to their employment prospects, but was also a psychological blow because of the loss of social status that it entailed. And the existing Jewish community in South Africa did not make life particularly easy for the newcomers. Upon their arrival, the German Jews found a community of over 72,000 Jews, concentrated mainly in the centers of Johannesburg and Cape Town, and most of them Eastern European Jews, particularly Litvaks, Lithuanians, who had migrated at the turn of the century. There had, of course, been Jewish migration from Germany to South Africa, especially during the 19th century, but the Jewish community in South Africa by this time was dominated by the Litvaks, both demographically and also in terms of its community organization and structure. The antagonisms between Eastern and Western European Jews had deep historical roots in the period of emancipation more than a century before and the long-standing struggle between modernity and tradition. And we see these hostilities playing themselves out again during the 1930s as German Jews started to seek refuge, not just in South Africa, but in many other parts of the world, in communities that were often populated by Eastern European Jews whose arrival preceded them by just a few decades. To begin with, the tension between the two communities in South Africa was evident in debates around immigration itself. So from early 1933, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies started receiving inquiries from German Jewish organizations and individuals in Germany who were interested in settling in South Africa. But the board at this time was very concerned about the political consequences of immigration, and especially was concerned about exacerbating anti-Semitism, which was itself a concern in South Africa at this time. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And so they discouraged German Jewish organizations from sending refugees to South Africa because of those concerns. Now, some were extremely critical of this position, particularly in later years. Others suggesting, by contrast, that the South African Jewish Board of Deputies should perhaps be judged less harshly, that there was a great deal of government and social anti-Semitism at the time, that the board, in fact, did help refugees on a range of issues, that they couldn't have predicted the Holocaust, and so on. So that remains a debate. And it should be said that at the same time as that debate was raging, an organized body was established in May of 1933 called the South African Fund for German Jewry, which offered refugees financial support as well as help with an array of things from learning the language to finding employment and accommodation, among many other things. There were also a number of prominent Jews in Cape Town who opposed the board's position, who took personal responsibility for supporting the immigrants. And here we have to pay tribute in particular to Leo Raffaeli, Max Sonnenberg, Jacob Gitlin, and there were others. In part because of the existing community's hostility, German Jewish refugees tended to keep to close-knit social circles. The image that I've put in front of you here is one of the few images that I could find in the public domain so that I could use. It's of members of the Adas Yeshurun congregation, which was established in Yeovil, but just to give you a visual image of German Jews. So they tended to keep to close-knit social circles. They established connections with any fellow German Jews they could find, from distant relatives and acquaintances of acquaintances to contacts recommended by a hairdresser. And we know from testimonies and memoirs that the shared ship journey to South Africa was the beginning of many lifelong friendships. One refugee recalled, "It was very difficult to get social contact with local Jews, and so most of the German Jews stayed amongst themselves here, and they were called cliquey." But the refugees' separation was also partly a symptom of the perceived cultural superiority of German Jews to Eastern European Jews, which will not be an unfamiliar notion to many of you, I'm sure. The settled community in South Africa may have laughed at the ways of the Yekkers, but the Yekkers in turn were often critical of South Africa's second-rate cultural and social life as they compared it with Western Europe. They held social gatherings in one another's homes where they spoke German and sang German songs. They settled in the same neighborhoods. They opened their own shops and restaurants. They established a number of social welfare organizations like Self-Help and Immigrants Help to provide assistance to fellow refugees. They set up their own religious congregations like Etz Chaim in Berea and Adas Yeshurun, which is the picture we can see here, an Orthodox congregation in Yeovil, in order to preserve familiar religious traditions. They also established a B'nai B'rith Lodge and an independent cultural association, which was a cultural forum initially only for the newcomers of the 30s. But at the same time, they were also anxious to prove their loyalty to South Africa right from the beginning. They learned the language, spoke it to their children, and particularly importantly, served in the armed forces. And again, this is a pattern that we see among German Jewish refugees in other parts of the world. So apart from the universal challenges of refugee life and tensions with the local community, another important aspect of the context that I want to establish is something I've briefly mentioned, and that is the increasing problem of anti-Semitism in this period. So during the 20s, there was growing support in South Africa, especially in Afrikaner nationalist circles, for the idea that Jews were unassimilable. This is the word that was used. They were unassimilable. In January 1930, the Quota Act was passed, which radically curtailed immigration from a number of so-called non-scheduled countries, including Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Russia, and Palestine. And although not explicitly named, East European Jews were the main target of this legislation. So German Jews were not affected by the Quota Act's restrictions, but relatively few of them came before the mid-1930s, only about 1,000. The numbers of immigrants began to increase much more substantially in 1936. And what changed in 1936 was a combination of worsening conditions for Jews in Germany and Arab opposition in Palestine, which caused the British to tighten immigration restrictions there. And so there was increased interest in alternative destinations, including South Africa. And the arrival of increasing numbers of immigrants increased anti-Semitic hostility from the Afrikaner nationalist opposition, as well as from the government itself. And a new set of restrictions was introduced that would take effect on the 1st of November 1936, which of course led to a spike in immigration numbers in the period immediately before those new laws came into force. And I would mention here especially the Stuttgart, which was a ship that was chartered that eventually brought in around 540 immigrants. It arrived on the 27th of October, 1936 in the pouring rain, met by a group of very rowdy and unhappy protesters, although the fact that it was raining meant that it was a much smaller group than it might have been. Accounts of the Stuttgart's arrival are legion, and it's really lodged itself as a seminal moment in Jewish communal memory. Mel Schnitzer, who was a refugee who arrived on the Stuttgart, recalled, "When we reached the docks, the first news which greeted us was that there had been a demonstration here in Cape Town against our landing, because a section of the population did not want us because we were Jews. It was an indescribable blow to us. Some women were in tears and begged to be allowed to go back to Germany." I should say that in understanding Jews' encounters with racism in South Africa and with the kind of anti-Semitism we're seeing here, the question of Jews' whiteness is an important complicating factor, which I won't go into now for reasons of time, but perhaps we can take it up in the Q&A after the lecture. So after the Stuttgart's arrival, there was ongoing protest and agitation against Jewish immigration. And in February 1937, a new Aliens Act came into force, which reduced Jewish immigration from Germany to a trickle. And the later refugees, those who arrived between 1937 and 1939, were limited to immediate family members and parents of earlier arrivals. So they tended to be an older immigration than those who had come before. And the outbreak of war in September 1939 virtually brought immigration to a halt. By the 1938 general election, anti-Semitism had become a central aspect of several mainstream parties' platforms in South Africa. The Nazi Party itself also began to make inroads. It established some local branches in the country, and Nazi-inspired political movements such as the South African Gentile National Socialist Movement, better known as the Grey Shirts, began to find popular audiences. And what you see here is a front page from the Grey Shirts official newspaper, Die Waarheid, the Truth. When war broke out in September 1939, only a very narrow parliamentary majority supported the decision to join the fighting on the side of the Allies. There is a substantial literature in the historiography on the question of links between Nazism and Afrikaner nationalism that I'm also not going to go into here, but it is worth emphasizing that while Afrikaner nationalism absorbed the influence of Nazi ideas in the 1930s and 40s, as I've been suggesting, that Nazism was never appropriated wholesale or without qualification, and that apartheid, when it was implemented in 1948, became in fundamental ways a distinct ideological and political system. At the same time, there is no doubt that Afrikaner nationalist politics in this period were influenced by ideas derived from Europe and especially from Nazi Germany, in particular in the arena of anti-Semitism. So while anti-Semitism was not absent from South Africa before this period, you see increasing evidence of explicitly political anti-Jewish behavior in a Nazi mold during the 1930s. And this is something that the historian Milton Shane has shown very persuasively and very comprehensively in his many writings. Okay, so there is lots more to say about German Jews in this period, but I want to spend the rest of my talk focusing on one question in particular, and that is German Jews' attitudes, understandings of attitudes towards South African racism. So I mentioned briefly in my opening that there were some refugees who were outspoken against what they perceived to be Nazi-style racism in their own backyard. So I'll start with a few examples of those. One of apartheid's most prominent German Jewish opponents was the lawyer and politician Harry Schwartz, who arrived in South Africa in 1934. His lifelong political career began with campaigning for the United Party in the 1948 election, or ahead of the 1948 election, and his energetic anti-apartheid work brought him to national prominence in the 1960s, when he emerged as a leader of a liberal offshoot of the United Party, which fought aggressively against the government's racial policies. From the perspective of Schwartz's family, as well as by his own account, Schwartz's commitment to social justice in South Africa was shaped by his childhood experiences in Nazi Germany. So here is a quote from his late wife, Annette, who said, "Seeing what happened under Hitler and coming to South Africa and seeing that a whole community of people were considered third-rate citizens just because of the color of their skin was something Harry could never understand. What happened to Germany, what Hitler did to people, he didn't want it happening in South Africa." And Schwartz himself explained his lifelong devotion to anti-racist activism by saying, "I know what the word discrimination means, not because I've read it in a book, but because I've been the subject of it." Like other Jewish activists, Schwartz also did not shy away from explicitly criticizing other Jews' behavior in relation to apartheid, particularly the South African Jewish leadership. In 2005, he wrote, "I believe that the board," referring to the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, "should be champions not merely of Jewish rights, but of a non-discriminatory society, something I asserted in the past and which I still assert today. We cannot ask not to be discriminated against if we accept or even just idly stand aside while others are victims of discrimination." So that's Harry Schwartz. Another German Jewish activist against South African racism was Franz Auerbach, who arrived with his family in Johannesburg in 1937. Auerbach often drew parallels between Nazism and apartheid, and in his many writings and talks and in his diverse activities, which ranged from research on apartheid education to very extensive work in the Jewish community on Holocaust commemoration and various other issues, he consistently identified clear links between Nazism and South African racism. Here's a quote from a 1977 article in which he declared, "We Jews must oppose racial and religious discrimination wherever we become aware of it, in Beirut or Berlin, Cairo or Kampala, Paris or Pretoria." And again, like Schwartz and other Jewish activists, he deliberately invoked the comparison between Nazism and South African racism in order to urge his fellow Jews to protest local injustices. And the final example I'll mention is the journalist Ruth Weiss, who came to South Africa from Germany with her parents in 1936. Woven throughout her own account of her activist work, as well as accounts of her work by prominent friends of hers, such as Nadine Gordimer, is a clear connection between her refugee past and her lifelong commitment to social justice in South Africa. Here's a quote from her memoir, A Path Through Hard Grass. She says, "Blacks under apartheid, Jews under the swastika. Was it all that different? It was a question I had to ask myself a long time ago. Racism is unacceptable. Social injustice is unacceptable. Anywhere, everywhere. That's what I've had to learn." Now, I should emphasize that it was not only refugees or even Jews who identified parallels between Nazism and racism in South Africa in the 1930s and 40s. To give you just one of many examples, in a declaration to the nations of the world that was drafted shortly after the end of the war, one of the most significant anti-racist movements of the time, a non-Jewish anti-racist movement, proclaimed, "The life of a non-European is very cheap in South Africa." Non-European meaning non-white. The life of a non-European is very cheap in South Africa, as cheap as the life of a Jew in Nazi Germany. Non-European, of course, being apartheid terminology. D.F. Malan's National Party, which came to power in 1948 on its apartheid platform, was widely referred to as the Mala-Nazis. And such analogies between the Afrikaner nationalists and the Nazis were intended in part to explain the nature of South Africa's racist regime to the world, and to mobilize the world's support in the struggle against it. And German Jews who became politically involved used that analogy in what are obviously especially personal ways. So those are three examples of German Jews who spoke out explicitly against racism in South Africa. For most German Jewish refugees, the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in South Africa was perhaps not quite so obvious. In untangling the question of German Jews' responses to racism, I will draw quite a few examples, as I mentioned, from the protagonist of my earlier book, Rudolf Schwab, who arrived in South Africa in 1936. And I'm using him as one of my examples, as a key example, not because his case is singular in any way, but because delving deeply into one case study where we have lots of rich materials allows me to draw out a little more the nuances of refugees' perceptions and understanding of racism, especially because at first glance, some of Schwab's attitudes appear to be in keeping with the figures I've just mentioned, Harry Schwartz, Franz Auerbach, Ruth Weiss. But I will bring in other examples too from the interviews and testimonies that I've been working with in order to construct a larger picture. And I want to suggest that the explanation here is quite nuanced and multi-stranded, that what we see here is not just a lack of activism or a lack of willingness to speak out against racism on the part of many Jews, but a combination of multiple factors. And I'll lay them out here and then speak a little about each of them. So what are the factors? First, that for many refugees, especially in the early period, there is simply a lack of knowledge and understanding of South African history and society, and especially its racial dynamics. Secondly, there is the fact that they were facing the huge challenge, as I've already mentioned, of building a new life, something with which they were clearly and justifiably preoccupied. Thirdly, that there is a tacit acceptance of the political and social status quo among many, and later this morphs into, slowly becomes a vested interest in the status quo, especially because of professional and economic success, and what that acceptance or vested interest in the status quo results in or manifests in is a gradual withdrawal from politics. And finally, what seems to me an important factor is a lack of recognition of what we might today see as obvious connections between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. I'd like to suggest that for many, if not most Jews in this period, the connection was not very evident at all. So Rudolf Schwab, like Harry Schwartz, became politically involved quite early on in his immigration, campaigning actively for the United Party during the 1940s, again like Schwarz, ahead of the 1948 elections, when the National Party unexpectedly swept to power with its policy of apartheid. In describing the National Party to his friends and relatives abroad in his letters, Rudolph often made reference to the Nazis, which, as I've suggested, was surely a pointed parallel for a German Jewish refugee to make. Ahead of the 1948 elections, he repeatedly warned that the NP is not much better than the Nazis. That's his phrase. And after the new government took office, he often used Nazi language in order to explain the absurdities and inconsistencies of apartheid policy. Just as in Nazi Germany, he said, the mixing of blood in South Africa is strictly forbidden, despite the obvious fact that there are no pure races left in the world. And here's a quote from just one of his letters in which he's mocking the government's attempts to criminalize miscegenation. He says, for example, at the moment, they're pushing through a law against immorality. Under this law, marriage and sexual relationships between whites, half-castes, and Indians will be strictly prohibited. These things have already been forbidden between whites and blacks for a long time. Their intention in and of itself is very laudable. But in practice, of course, and given that we have neither a residence registration office nor any kind of official population register, it's completely impossible to differentiate accurately between farmers, sailors, and fishermen who've been browned by the sun, to name but a few crass examples, and the entirely white-skinned children of half-caste parents. The whole business is laughable and impossible to implement. Now, Rudolph's opposition to the National Party is, of course, not as straightforward as it appears at first glance, as you may have noticed in this extract. While he ridicules the apartheid government's laws, he also affirms that their intention in and of itself is very laudable. In other words, his objection stems not from ethical principles or concern with racial policy, but rather with the difficulty of classification. In fact, it's clear that Rudolph saw few connections between the anti-Semitism he had witnessed, that he'd suffered from in Europe, and the anti-Black racism that he encountered in his new homeland. His opposition to the apartheid government was based not so much on its racial policies as on the declining economic situation. He consistently recognized in his letters, he knew that the international community equated a nationalist government with a Nazi government, but the main fear for him was that this was causing the withdrawal of foreign investment. He was a small business owner struggling to keep his enterprise going, and so he was worried about the impact of politics on the country's economy. And in his letters, he insisted that while South Africa had its problems, they were mild compared with what was going on in the rest of the world. And in this period, the main concern with Rudolph, as for many others, was the communist threat. The historian Gideon Shimoni, whose extensive research on South African Jews has focused, among many other things, on Jews and apartheid, writes, and now I'm quoting from Shimoni, casting the lot of Jews with that of non-Europeans was absolutely inconceivable for the mindset of all but the tiniest minority of Jewish communists who had long been alienated from Jewish identification and were peripheral to Jewish affairs. In other words, according to Shimoni, the vast majority of Jews could not identify with a lot of Black South Africans. While there was a tiny handful of Jews who participated in radical anti-racist causes, they were few and far between. Whereas if one looks at the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, the representative organ of the community representing perhaps the mainstream, followed a policy of non-involvement in politics, save where the rights of Jews as Jews were directly affected. So we're looking here at German Jewish refugees, so I want to focus on issues and examples that relate specifically to their position and experiences in South Africa. As I suggested earlier, especially in the early period of their immigration, there was an issue of simply lacking knowledge and understanding about South African history and society. So the next example that I'm going to read is from a refugee who was interviewed by the Kaplan Center in the early 1980s, and he was asked by the interviewer how he felt about Black people when he arrived in South Africa. And he says, "When I arrived in the docks in Cape Town, I saw a considerable number of Black laborers trying to dock the boat. And already then, unconsciously, I remember still today, I was thinking it's not possible to treat human beings the way these people at the docks looked. And it was against my grain to see them looking the way they looked. But then his subsequent comments in the interview are a bit more revealing about his understanding or lack thereof of structural inequality in South Africa. So the interviewer then goes on to ask whether he treated Black people the same way that he would treat any other Gentiles. And he replies, well, I never treated anybody different, and I would not treat a colored or Black man any other way because it is just against my philosophy, that I would not want to be as badly treated as they have been treated myself. I must say that when I had the idea of going to Africa, I was quite prepared to being a laborer and building roads and this sort of thing, and was indeed pleasantly surprised that the country was developed at that stage already to such an extent that I was immediately raised to a higher standard that I had expected on account of the fact the Black population is doing such labor that I thought I would have to do. Obviously, I was pleased of such a status in one way, but sad to see the Blacks, not at that time anyway, making any progress and improving their lot. So this refugee, in other words, could not understand why Blacks allowed themselves, as it were, to be treated in this way. And he saw this as more as a cause for pity or condescension than for anger or affront. Other refugees in their interviews and testimonies similarly seem to suggest an assumption that Black people were happy or content with their place in the social structure and an implicit acceptance of the racial status quo, or at least no sense that there was a need to challenge it. Here's another example of an interview that was done for the Kaplan Center at UCT in 1983. This refugee says, "We took the status of the underdog for granted, and they took it for granted. They were quite happy in their way of life." He's referring to Black people in South Africa. "We took up the attitude of the other white people, considering them as born to do the hard labor. We did not think about it or have discussions about it like today." As this last quote suggests, and there's lots of similar evidence, German Jewish refugees gradually accepted the values and the vocabulary that were commonplace in white South African society. And we see similarly in Rudolf Schwab's letters as well. So in his letters, he often complained about the laziness and the unreliability of his native boys. He uses the word boys or worse language, which I will not repeat. And he often complained that people outside South Africa simply didn't understand the complexity of its racial problems. So here's a quote from Rudolph's letter. "The whole question of domestic servants is rather more trying here and very difficult for Mrs. Schwab. She has just now had to dismiss another native boy because he did not do the work she told him to do. Even my leading hands," this is in his own business, "one of whom has been with me for over 4 years, are still on the whole rather independable, and unless they're watched all the time, their work slacks off. A great improvement will occur once they're all able to go to school properly from early childhood and are properly trained. This imposes a heavy strain on the pockets of the comparatively small white population here, as well as a great responsibility. After all, there are more than 4 colored persons here to every white, and the great majority have only started coming into towns for work during the last 10 years or so and return for 2 to 6 months out of every year to their tribe or kraal in one of the reserves to help their tribe with sowing, reaping, or tilling the land, or just for lazing around. It's difficult to properly train and educate such a shifting and unsettled population. To get enough of their number well enough trained to become teachers alone is a Herculean task. I wonder whether the delegates at the UN, at the United Nations, thought about some of our problems here when they told us how to run our country." So Rudolph's writing here at the height of his involvement in United Party work, and I think betrays an attitude that is both condescending and paternalistic, and one that was also quite commonplace at the time. One key point that perhaps needs explaining is what support for the United Party versus the National Party meant in the context of South African politics. The National Party was seen as an exclusivist, anti-Semitic party that had supported the German war effort. So there were obvious reasons why it did not have widespread support from Jews, whereas the United Party was a much more comfortable political home for South Africa's Jews. But despite its more reform-minded policies, it was still also firmly predicated on white dominance, on white minority rule. There were liberal elements in the United Party that later broke with the party to pursue more progressive reforms, and I mentioned that earlier in the context of Harry Schwartz. who really led that effort, but Rudolf and many other Jews did not join them. I'm going to turn my PowerPoint off now because I don't have any more quotes, and it's nice to be able to see people. So more German Jewish refugees, I would say, fell into Rudolf's category than into Harry Schwartz's. Rudolf's status as a small business owner had earlier, as I suggested, fueled his opposition to the National Party government. But like many South African Jews, he also enjoyed the economic benefits of apartheid and became quite comfortable under the apartheid government. It's difficult to pin down the extent to which economic concerns shaped Jews' political attitudes towards apartheid, but their economic success was undoubtedly a key aspect of their comfort in South Africa. It's also important to re-emphasize that beyond politics, German Jewish refugees had countless challenges to confront, from surviving on meager resources when they first arrived, to finding a job and housing, learning a language, establishing social support, all those things that I mentioned earlier. Most were probably too preoccupied with the basic concerns of existence to be concerned about institutionalized racism. Reflecting on German Jewish refugees' relationship with South Africa, the historian Stephen Ashheim, who is himself the South African son of German Jewish refugees, writes, and I'm quoting here from Ashheim, "It was quite simply gratitude, which was the most characteristic and understandable response of these German Jewish immigrants to their adopted country. At a time when the gates of the world had been closed to them, South Africa had given them refuge." And then he adds another dimension. He says the warmth of the welcome and the gratitude they felt was reinforced by the professional and financial success many of them rapidly achieved in an expanding and industrializing economy. They too had acquired a vested interest in things as they were. This was a powerful combination, limiting, if not entirely eliminating, any inclination to generalize from their own experience of racial injustice in Germany and protest against what was happening in South Africa. Working through the primary source material available about these refugees, I've really been struck by the widespread absence of engagement with questions of racism and politics. There's a pioneering study that was done by a sociologist, Frieda Sichel, who was in fact herself one of the refugees. She published it in 1966, basing it on extensive research and surveys. And her study suggests that these refugees tacitly accepted the political status quo and hardly engaged with apartheid at all. In later interviews, some of the refugees emphasize the risks of political outspokenness in explaining why they didn't engage in politics. But many of them also state a simple lack of interest in politics at the time. One man I interviewed in 2009, a rabbi who was the child of German Jewish refugees who arrived in the 30s, said, "Politics didn't play a part in their minds. They were just pleased to be able to get out of Germany and to get their parents out." I mentioned earlier the Independent Cultural Association, which was one of many institutions established by German Jews. And this association was unusual among the German Jews institutions in that it did engage explicitly in political issues and particularly questions of race relations. From time to time, it also had other programming, but it also included in that program was engagement with political issues. Ruth Weiss, who I mentioned earlier, the journalist, recalled that many of those who were active in the association were appalled by the social structures they encountered in South Africa and the exploitation of Black workers. And a few of them even joined the South African Communist Party. But even she acknowledges that this activity had its limits and its critics, particularly among the older generation of refugees. So she says her parents discouraged her involvement with the Independent Cultural Association because of the extent to which politics dominated its activities. She writes, "They equated political with communist and felt this to be dangerous in the country in which we found ourselves, just as it had been dangerous in Germany." In other words, there's an instinct to keep your head down, to not rock the boat. And research suggests that similar dynamics were also at play among German Jewish communities in other parts of the world. In his book, Generation Exodus, Walter Lacour concludes that most of the German Jewish refugees who reached the US, Latin America, and elsewhere were not particularly politically minded, and that there was very little radical politics among them. He writes, in the late 1930s, and especially in the years after the war, the great ideal was to become as quickly as possible a real American, or one might say a real Brazilian or Australian or South African. In other words, to integrate and become a loyal member of one's homeland. Rudolf Schwab's political involvement flagged after the United Party's election defeat in 1948, and he turned his attention inward to the Jewish community and caring for his young children. And his withdrawal from politics and into Jewish community issues echoed that of many other German Jewish refugees, and indeed that of the Jewish community as a whole in the 1950s and 60s. So there's just one final issue I want to raise in untangling the question of German Jews' responses to racism, and that's the assumption that there are clear connections or resonances between South African racism and anti-Semitism, especially Nazi anti-Semitism. I think it's an assumption that is often implicit in discussions about Jews and apartheid, and especially in the case of German Jewish refugees, there's often the suggestion that they in particular might reasonably have been expected to identify those links, even if they decided not to do anything about them. And I think this is an assumption that is worth exposing and interrogating. As I suggested earlier, I think part of the key to understanding German Jews' responses is to seeing that whatever else its origins, this is also in part a lack of recognition of parallels between Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa. In other words, an inability to identify parallels at the time. In today's world, we're all accustomed to the Holocaust being the obvious benchmark for all sorts of other racisms. But these connections are very much the product of a particular political and ideological moment and were not obvious to observers 70 or 80 years ago. In fact, I'd suggest that before the 1980s at the earliest, few Jews understood anti-Semitism to be related in any meaningful way to anti-Black racism. That German Jews were victims of what we would now call a racialized system was, I think, neither evident nor especially significant to the vast majority of Jews and indeed others at the time. The political views that Rudolf and many other Jews expressed were, as I said, quite commonplace at the time, and were regarded as quite different from the ideas of Afrikaner nationalists, those who sought the legislated separation of the races and what some saw as Nazi-like purity of blood. While a handful of German Jewish refugees were drawn by their experiences to political activism, most, as I've suggested, drew different conclusions. If they had political inclinations, they were overwhelmingly towards Zionism, which flourished in a political landscape in South Africa premised on distinct group identities. And this is, of course, not to excuse or to justify what were in some cases racist views and behaviors, but rather to try and understand the historical context that informed them, in which they made sense, and also how well-meaning, sympathetic, and thoughtful people came to espouse them. I think, given the time, I'd like to leave my talk there, and just to reiterate that there are still lots of questions that I have from this body of source material that I'm working through, but I would very much value people's questions, comments about what I've presented today, and certainly if people have suggestions of further context or source material, I'm very happy to hear them. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Shirli, for this amazing talk. I hope all the audience will join me in a virtual round of applause. And we have just a few minutes for some questions which have been posted in the chat. As I said before, we will not be taking questions directly from the floor, but if people have questions, they are welcome to enter them, and we may need to be selective in the questions that we pick for responses. So I'm going to try in first instance to focus on those questions in the chat which are most closely related to the topic of your talk, the specific topic of your talk, which is to do with attitudes towards racism among the immigrant German Jewish community in South Africa. So I have a question here in the chat from Taffy Gold, which I'll read out. Were the Litvaks in South Africa less concerned about the Nazi character of apartheid?
So thank you very much for the question. And I would say that if we're thinking about Jews concerned about links between Nazism and Afrikaner nationalism, well, let me try and make my answer clearer. I think the biggest separation in my mind is less between German Jews and Litvak Jews, and more within the Jewish community between those who chose radically to oppose apartheid and those who did not. So this is also something that changes over time. I mean, the question is a big one that one could answer differently for different historical periods. So certainly, you know, in the period of the 1930s and 40s that I've been discussing, the Nazi links with Afrikaner nationalism, the kind of Nazi-inspired anti-Semitism that was being seen, was as much of a concern to Litvak Jews as it was to German Jews. This was not something that affected German Jews more than it did others. And of course, we have to remember that the Litvak community in South Africa at that time was still a relatively young community. Many of them, you know, the percentage of those who were native born was substantial, but there were still many who had themselves come from Lithuania. They all still had family in Lithuania. So certainly Litvaks were very much concerned about the potential Nazi connections. So, you know, I think if there is a difference, it comes in the later period after as apartheid legislation is introduced in the course of the 50s, and apartheid beds in, as it were, and there is, on the part of what we might call the mainstream community, or a mainstream Jewish community, or a large segment of the Jewish community, that chooses not to remember. I mean, it's something that Claudia Brody, who I know is with us today, calls a willful amnesia about the Nazi past. There is a segment of the Jewish community that, it seems, in order to effect a rapprochement with the nationalist government, espouses a kind of willful amnesia about the Nazi period. And that's the large segment of the community. This is probably a crude characterization, but let's leave it at that. And then there is a small segment of the Jewish community, those who are involved in radical opposition to apartheid, some of whom might be willing to make those links between the Nats and the Nazis. But there, the division between them, as I was suggesting earlier, is not Litvaks versus German Jews. There, the bigger division is between those in the Jewish community who don't want to talk about that history at all, and those who continue to point back to it as a way of reminding, whether it's fellow Jews or fellow South Africans or those in the wider world that they're hoping to mobilize to their struggle, of those very real connections that had existed in the 1930s and 40s. Hopefully that made sense as an answer.
Thank you. So you are basically saying that there isn't a fundamental distinction to be drawn between Litvak Jews and German Jews. There's a string, at least in this context.
In this context, yes.
In this context, yes. There's a string of questions from Professor Antony Polonsky in the chat, which I could perhaps try and condense and direct towards the same discussion. But that is, can you identify or can you say something about German Jews involved in the Congress movement or in the Marxist-Leninist movements, or perhaps a distinction between Orthodox and Reform congregations? Are there any differentiations that could be made at that level when it comes to the engagement with racism?
So thank you, Anthony, for all of those questions. And I note also a question about German Jews in South Africa before 1933. And these are, of course, all wonderful and very large questions. And given the time and that I see there are lots of other questions, I'm going to, with apologies, and I hope you won't mind, be relatively brief, but it would be good to continue the conversation about this. My short answer to your question about whether there were German Jews in the Congress movement or who adopted a Marxist-Leninist position, not that I've yet found. And I'm looking for more examples. As I said, I'm towards the beginning of working through a very big body of primary source material, but as I've said, I'm finding frustratingly little of German Jews, specifically refugees, is what I'm interested in, who become very engaged. So that's the short answer to your question. Then you ask about the Reform synagogues established by German Jews, and Sasha put the spin on that question about what is the difference in responses to racism or responses to apartheid among Reform and Orthodox. And here I'm giving, again, a very brief and crude answer, but I would say that there was, trying to think also about how to phrase this in a way that's not too judgmental, but also pithy. One tends to find if there is opposition or there is a willingness or openness to speaking out against racial inequality and later against apartheid, it's much more likely to come out, of course, in the Reform synagogues than it is in the Orthodox synagogues. And again, I would recommend people here to an article written by Claudia Brody a number of years ago, but I think is really interesting, which studies rabbinic sermons in Orthodox rabbi sermons, and shows what she suggests is a gradual or not so gradual withdrawal from political issues in religious contexts, whereas what we find in the Reform movement, which was begun by, of course, Rabbi Weiler, or really got onto its feet thanks to Rabbi Weiler and the participation of the German Jews. There was much more space there for work in the areas of social justice and so on, but that it wasn't just peopled by German Jews, although German Jews were the ones who were more active in it at the beginning. I should mention, though, that I also talked about Adas Yeshurun, which was a congregation that was established in Yeovil by German Jews because they were appalled at some of the practices that they found of the Litvaks, who are Orthodox in name, but did not practice in the kind of Orthodox fashion that they had expected or hoped to find. And David Sachs has written a number of very helpful articles about Adas Yeshurun, arguing that it was itself the basis for the religious revival that began, especially in Johannesburg, in the 1970s. So that's also a legacy of German Jews.
Thank you. And one final question from the floor from Peter Houston. How do the Boerenjood fit in the mix?
Thank you, Peter, for that question, and nice to see you here too. How do they fit into, well, this particular story? I would say the story of the German Jewish refugees, not so much, but I suppose what you're asking is where do they fit into the story of Jewish responses to racism? And there I would say, this is something that anyone who has ever approached me with an interest in doing doctoral research on South African Jews, I have suggested to them that they do some more work on Jews in rural communities in South Africa, Jews' relationships with Afrikaners, what is happening in these rural communities. It's not a question that I can answer in any great granular detail because the examples that I've seen, it's what one sees is a diversity of responses across the board. One sees both a great sensitivity to issues of inequality all the way across to Jews who are happy to espouse apartheid policies, as they play out in the spaces where they live. And of course, the particular social dynamics that come of living in small towns where they are not established Jewish communities, where they are perhaps experiencing if not anti-Semitism, then perceptions, different kinds of perceptions of them, particularly from Afrikaner populations. I suppose I'm giving the usual historian's answer, which is both a cop-out and entirely genuine, which is that it's so diverse and so dependent on context that I don't want to give a kind of overarching explanation that would say, well, the Boerejood, that the Boerejood is a term that means, I suppose, Afrikaner Jew. Boer in Afrikaans means farmer, but it's also the word that is that historically was used to refer to Afrikaners. So anyway, thank you, Peter, for the question.
Thank you very much. I will now call on Philippa Goldmeier, the wife and widow of Michael, to deliver a few words in tribute.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Professor Gilbert, Shirli, thank you so much for that outstanding lecture. It was so interesting and informative. And I think Michael would have been truly humbled to have this talk in his memory. I'd also like to thank the college for putting on this event, particularly Professors Stern and Geller and Berkowitz, whom Michael held in such high esteem. Michael thoroughly enjoyed his all too brief time at UCL Jewish Studies Department. Those of you who knew him will know that he approached all his work with 100% dedication. And I know he was a brilliant student here and was passionate about his subject. Myself and my family feel very sad that he wasn't able to complete his MA. He would have been particularly interested in the lecture subject as he was the child, as Shirley said, of refugees from Nazi Germany. The Goldmeier family originally came from Bavaria and have been farmers there for hundreds of years. Michael's father, Justin, came to London in the early 30s as a merchant for his cousin's wine business in Frankfurt. And by the mid-30s, he settled in the UK as it was unsafe for him to return to Germany because of Nuremberg laws and rising anti-Semitism. But he managed to secure sponsors in the UK to enable many of his family members to come and join him, thereby saving many lives. Michael's mother, Helen, was indeed lucky to be chosen as a chaperone for the children on the Kindertransport as late as 1939. The majority of her family were killed in the camps. Growing up with that background narrative, Michael had a strong social and moral conscience and paid particular attention to the experience of refugees. Although he had a long career as a litigation lawyer, he spent time as a judge at the Immigration Tribunal, and he also gave so much of his time to Jewish Care and many other communal organizations. He sought out prejudice wherever it existed and challenged it in a quiet and unassuming way. His parents were forever grateful to the UK for giving them a home, and Michael was a proud British Jew. Showing gratitude to society around him was an important value he held, and he maximized each moment of each day, giving to others through his wise counsel, knowledge, and intellect. Make your Torah study fixed, say little and do much, and receive everyone with a cheerful face. These are the words inscribed on his stone and how he lived his life. His journey was not complete yet, and as a family, we can continue what he began and hope that his memory will be for a blessing always. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have to now bring the event to a close. I'm going to thank Shirley in particular for her remarkable lecture. Also members of the audience who have posted some very interesting comments, which we haven't been able to do justice to. I could mention Claudia Browdy, which perhaps we could make available these comments if that's technically possible later on. And above all, to the Goldmeier family for inspiring us to hold this event, which we've all learnt very much from, and which we can take forward with us alongside all our good memories of Michael as a student in our department. So thank you very much to everyone, and I shall now say goodbye. Sarah, you want to post a few things on the screen about future meetings. But for now, thank you very much to everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody. I'll say goodnight. And if you'd like to look at our flyer, we do have another lecture next Thursday. So we do hope to see you all then, and very many future events. So thank you for coming tonight, and goodbye to everybody for now.